going to talk about people plus machines today. That's our topic, but we're not going to let the machines talk. It's just going to be the people. And we have, in fact, two special people, two brand new CEOs, Paul Hudson from Sanofi, who started on September 1st, and Julie Sweet, who also started on September 1st. It's kind of, that's how you get on the stage, if you started on September 1st as a CEO. And also, congratulations to Julie, who just today made Fortune's Business Person of the Year list for 2019.
Oh, no.
Thank you. Thank you.
That was fast.
No pressure, Paul. Everyone attending the conference, probably everybody watching, is thinking about AI, how it's being implemented at your company, or what it might mean for your career. I just, was thinking about a couple of stats. And here's a stat from Accenture. By 2035, you projected that AI will add $14 trillion in revenue globally. There's another stat just the other day. Bank of America projected that AI and automation could make 800 million jobs disappear. So we have a lot of hope and fear around this topic. And as we're looking at that, I was hoping, Julie, you could start us out by just giving us, pulling back from the hype and the stats and giving us a look from your work with clients around the world. Where are we on the maturity curve, the adoption? Where are we in the progress of bringing AI and automation into what companies are really doing?
Well, you might say there's a maturity of the fear factor. How about that? Meaning, so we just
Did you just coin that?
I just did.
All right.
In listening to you about that. So, I think what you've seen over the last 5 years has been, a lot of discussion about it, and every year there's a little more maturity, right? So we're not spending a lot of time as Accenture going around and educating what is artificial intelligence, right? The question today is all about how do you scale the impact. And at the same time, we just did, and we'll give you a stat that said, we just put out a new study where 75% of C-suite executives believe that their survival depends on the ability to scale. So we are, I think, at an inflection point on everyone understands it has upsides, it's critical to the business, there are things we have to manage, but fundamentally, we have to move into an era of being able to scale the impact while managing and bringing our people along the journey.
Mm-hmm. When we spoke on the phone a couple weeks ago, another stat that you mentioned was you said that roughly you see about 70% of companies are getting into the basics of AI in some level, and maybe 15% have some of the scale. What is that? How do you make that dividing line? What does it mean that they're getting into the basics of the technology?
Well, I'd say, there's an individual who's in charge of data analytics, artificial intelligence. There's a lot of pilots typically and experiments that aren't moving the needle, but they're really trying to do so. You tend to still be mostly IT-led in terms of at most companies, so not really yet really led by the business side, and a lot of awareness. That's where many companies are pivoting to, well, now, okay, we get it. So we call it, so that's the proof phase. And then you've got another 15% of companies who are in what we would call sort of pockets of greatness, right? So the comms industry, particularly in the US, for example, has now really embraced artificial intelligence in the call center area. That's the second biggest cost center after the network. And we've been working with companies where you now have 70% of all calls are digital. And what used to be 20 minutes with a human is now 3 to 4 minutes, so reducing cost and significantly raising customer engagement, and also freeing up the people in the call center to do a lot more interesting work, right? So, and that's big and it's material. It's still not across the enterprise, and we're starting to see a few companies really say, we are going to own. It's not just artificial intelligence, you have to have the data. We're going to own that space across the enterprise and be the competitive leader in this. And that's a very small percentage.
I read that 63% of people actually prefer chatbots to humans. maybe I'm not talking to the right chat bots yet, but
You probably don't know.
yeah, maybe not. Paul, let's turn to you for a second. So you're new to your current position, but you've been in the pharma industry for a long time. Usually when we hear about AI in the pharma space, there's a lot of talk about how it's going to be applied to, come up with incredible new personalized medications. Julie mentioned pockets of greatness, and you mentioned when we were talking pockets of brilliance that you see, but also a lot of challenges. So as you're coming in and taking a fresh look at your new company, but in an industry you know well, what is the state of things, and how can you apply this technology to what you're doing at Sanofi?
So when we spoke, we talked a little bit about moments of greatness. We had, there's never been a better time to take the role as CEO, and we were talking about it earlier, that we can sort of let go of some of the prejudices and some of the ways of working that are decades old. And we can look forward at leapfrogging to do things differently. We can do it because tech and data and all forms of automation, machine learning, AI, are putting us in a position where we get to rethink the everyday. And when you're taking over leadership of a business, you have a chance to, with fresh eyes, with justification, ask what can be done differently. Now, when from our perspective, and I enjoyed talking to you in the run-up to this around, I was in a lab, one of our labs in Boston, and you walk into one of our traditional labs, and of course, as you'd expect, there is a lot of people in white coats with safety goggles on, right? It's good practice. You turn a corner, and there's a robot, and the robot is processing over 200 different proteins against tissue types 24 hours a day to try and work out what could happen. And taking out, not replacing people, don't get me wrong, but replacing the capacity of the people that we had, meaning we can do 20x, 50x what we used to find new medicines. At the same time, same lab, I was walking just a little bit further along to our personalized healthcare group, and I met a young scientist, and I was drawn to the display on her computer, and it looked like some sort of children's painting. And I said, "What is that?" And she said, "It's a single immune cell in a person with an autoimmune disease." And I'm looking at a single immune cell because I was AI enabled to find that one cell that needs a personalized medicine to do something about it. And if we can create a medicine for one person, wouldn't that be amazing? And for my role and for our industry, we're moving very quickly to using AI to help us do two fundamental things: create individual medicines, to find those medicines based on a needle in a haystack that we just couldn't do as human beings, couldn't do as a computer on its own, can do in partnership. And then to look to manage not one person, but everybody. Population health, how we'll intervene, how we'll help countries get through difficult pandemics, for example. It's never been a better time to be part of it.
So this is the brand new facility that you just opened in Massachusetts you're talking about, right?
It's not.
It's different.
No, it's an equally cool place, but
Okay.
it's not quite. You're referring, I think, to Framingham.
Yes.
So not long in the job, I take no pleasure in saying that I got to cut the ribbon on a new manufacturing facility. I'd had nothing to do with it, but I have to be honest, I was completely blown away. I was with Governor Baker, we were in Massachusetts. I get to cut the ribbon. In fact, I asked members of the team to do it because it wouldn't have been appropriate for me, but I was delighted to be there. It's a facility where we make monoclonal antibodies. And over the last few years, we built what we think will be the best monoclonal antibody site anywhere in the world, any company. It allows us to reduce CO2 by 80%, reduce energy costs in general by close to 90%, reduce wastewater by 90%, and to increase the output of antibodies we can create to fight difficult diseases down to very small populations by 80-fold. In fact, Governor Baker, who did cut the ribbon, he also had nothing to do with it, but who did cut the ribbon, he said this site was so good that if it was running for office, it'd probably get elected.
Okay, so those are some moments of brilliance, brand new facilities, new applications of technology. But we also talked about, some of the challenges you have throughout the rest of the business, the legacy of the business, and, taking those moments of brilliance and translating that downstream into selling your products, reaching patients. Talk about, how you are trying to translate that, and with a fresh set of eyes at the company, trying to take on that data challenge.
So for 2 or 3 decades, we would do very comprehensive, almost decade-long studies of medicines. We would print off tens of thousands of pages, and we would put them in files, and we would present them to the regulators of the world, let's say the FDA. There would be the equivalent of several terabytes worth of information, but it was printed, because that's how the regulator liked to receive it. Now, also remember that all of that data, all of that sits on patients and patients' data that have been exposed to medicines over a number of years. That data, after the submission and approval, is put in a cardboard box. It's sealed, and Iron Mountain or somebody similar takes it away just in case 10 or 20 or 30 years later, something is noticed, or there is a signal, or there's some issue where the regulator says, we'd like to go back and look at that. And that tended to be where that data stopped. I think the sprint now is not only the data going forward, which we collect almost entirely electronically, is to go back and look at decades worth and petabytes worth of data to say, are there clues in here? Are there clues in this data that will help us discover a drug, target a mechanism, save a life, change a life, transform a life, that we just didn't have the human computing power to be able to do anything about? And now we have a chance to thank the patients again for what they contributed to the studies, and go back and machine learn that data and then run our own algorithms on top of it. It's incredible. So what we find, whether it's one single immune cell, whether it's looking at the data of patients who represented what we did, whether it's helping us remove the transactional from accounts payable, or whether it's all the way through to how we show up to see a physician and knowing what their preferences are, what they've looked at online to do with our medicines, and then converge the human and the tech to have a much more meaningful conversation with the desire for a better outcome for patients. That's incredible. That's why, by the way, it's so much fun right now to take the job. These things just weren't possible to people that have done this role before.
Right. Julie, I mean, there are a lot of companies that theoretically would like to access all of this incredible data that they have and figure out ways to pull new insights out of it, but it's a challenge. It requires not only leadership to push it through, to explain why, but maybe to reorganize the company around this effort. What are you seeing from companies about which ones are taking this on and why? What's the catalyst to push them forward on these efforts?
Well, Paul and I bonded as new CEOs, and new CEOs obsessed with data, right? Because I think we often start talking about artificial intelligence and the promise of artificial intelligence, but it's fundamentally not going to, fulfill that promise without the data. And Paul's a great example of companies that are successful. It's because it starts with the CEO, and it starts with the CEO's priorities. I mean, one thing we've had over the last 5 years is a lot of lessons learned on what not to do. And there's been so much excitement about artificial intelligence and digitization that in many cases, it was let a thousand flowers bloom, right? And what you found was you had a lot of, by the way, a lot of different consultants, a lot of different tools, a lot of great pilots, which even if they were wildly successful, will never make a material impact. And so what we're really seeing is that getting out of that proof period, a lot of times that proof period was the CEO saying, okay, someone go do this, okay, that's great, but it wasn't a CEO-led initiative that said, this has to be a priority, it has to matter, right? It has to matter when I go talk to my board, when I talk to the street. And when you do smaller things, it has to be strategic because it will lead to something material. And so, when we, take a step back and are talking to companies, like how do you spend the money smart, is you start with the CEO priorities, the outcomes, and then you develop a data strategy that meets those and pays for it along the way.
You used a catchphrase that I liked a lot, DQ, But I think of Dairy Queen when I hear that. But explain what DQ is along the lines of EQ and IQ.
Right, so DQ, one of the things that if you want to be a data-driven company, you have to really understand what is the power of data and how can it, how do you use it? If you find all the data and then no one actually uses it to change the way they act, and so we coined the term, it actually started with something called TQ, so technology quotient, and we said it also means DQ, right? And that's about an education of how do you actually use data, because the other thing we find is you can create phenomenal, these great visualization tools. You use a special platform, we have lots of them, to take data out, create the tool and provide it, and then nothing changes, right? No decision's different, it still takes 5 sets of approvals, right? So the real-time data doesn't matter, right? And so the idea of DQ is really understanding the power of data and what has to change. It is never about the technology. And the data itself, however pretty you make it, it doesn't matter unless the organization changes, which is what takes you back to the CEO, because in most cases, one of the biggest issues in big companies is the way you make changes, the approval layers, stop the power of data making an impact.
I just want to remind everybody, if you have a question, to raise your hand. We'll get you a mic. I'd love to hear from people in the audience. But so that gets to one of my questions, which is the mistakes that people are making, companies are making in trying to adapt to these technologies and implement them. Paul, what have you seen? What are the stumbling blocks that you've seen at your previous companies or just in the industry that you have to avoid in your new role as you lead this change?
Yeah, I think you touched on them actually brilliantly. I think there is a bit of a rush. I wouldn't call them vanity projects, but I would call them projects that make people feel good about that they're ahead of the curve, that they've leapfrogged, that they are cutting edge, over-delegated, no impact. I would perhaps refer to them as superficial intelligence. There are a lot of people that spend a lot of time wanting to dress up the commitment. Now, in our industry, if you asked anybody at all, they would tell you we are an innovation-led industry. We absolutely are. If you're in a laboratory and you're creating medicine from nothing and spend 10 years evolving it and making sure as you can that it's safe, and you do this, you're innovation-led, right? So there is almost an excuse not to continue to stretch yourself beyond that with data and digital because you're already innovative, right? Mm-hmm. So the big companies, I think, strike big global strategic partnerships with the big cloud organizations, all great. But to your point, unless it turns into something, unless you're fully vested, you pick your projects well, you have shared and aligned incentives with who you partner with, and you're really able to execute for the good of something, not to prove the tech, but to prove a better outcome. In our case, a new medicine, let's say, for example, or treat a disease or identify a rare disease. I think there's too many people drawn a little bit like magpies to the cool stuff. Mm-hmm. And now we're just at the point, finally, a tipping point of you can't resist it. So now we have to do something incredible with it. And I think that's where we are, and that's where we're going to be.
Your company announced a partnership with a big cloud-oriented company this summer, Google, before you started, an innovation center project. How are you going to make sure that you get the most of that and that is a fruitful endeavor and not superficial intelligence?
It's the same as all the projects. You have to start with what the aligned incentive is. What are you trying to prove? What do you bring to the table each company? You can't delegate that work. You have to be shoulder to shoulder to do incredible things. We bring often biology, healthcare understanding, patient understanding, and now the big cloud-based organizations bring the ability to look at huge amounts of data to help with their engineers write perfect algorithms to solve problems. But neither of you can do it without each other. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure even with the partnerships we have, there will be bumps in the road because you have to stay aligned and iterate that together without losing sight of the goal. I'm less interested in the press release and more interested in the outcome. And that's where we'll really find out whether we did the right things together.
Just one more call. We have a question over here. Just please quickly identify yourself.
Hi. Yeah, Karima Sabar, Quark Venture. I wanted to ask, the true value of data is really in the external data to you at Sanofi or any other pharma company, the data that rests in the health authorities, the patient data, the longitudinal databases that can then inform to drug development and the next generation of therapies. There's a lot of mistrust of big companies in general, drug companies in particular, in what they're going to do with this data. How are you addressing that, and how are you engaging these important constituents, the patients and the health professionals, to address that?
The trust issue, that's a big question.
Look, we have to earn trust, of course, but we need to make sure that the very specific rules of that data engagement are adhered to without hesitation. We need to set those ground rules very, very early. And frankly, the type of work we do, we are less interested in individual patient data because it just would be inappropriate. We are much more interested in themes and about trends in that data. I'll give you a good example. We're working on a flu vaccine at the moment, and it would cost hundreds of millions, if not close to $1 billion, to do research in a certain area. We work with Kaiser in California to run a real-world evidence study on over 1.4 million patients. We will never know who they are, nor should we be interested in who they are. But we do care that if you get a vaccine, that you might avoid a hospital admission. We do care that it might mean a better cardiovascular outcome over time. It can mean many different things. We can't hesitate because we'll miss chances to change health. But we must absolutely not blink on the rules.
Julie, you must have examples of companies taking on this trust challenge as well. What do you see in terms of best practices in handling the trust issue?
Well, one of the most important things to do is when you set up your program with artificial intelligence is to actually have responsible governance and build in tools. We have tools, there's lots of tools out there that, for example, look at bias and make sure from the beginning you don't have bias, to be able to understand, and explain. In some cases it's regulated, like in the financial services, but actually from a trust perspective, it doesn't matter if you're regulated, you need to be able to articulate how you're using it. And a new area that we see a lot of focus on is actually employee data and having trust with your employees. Our studies show that employees actually don't mind you using your data if they get value out of it, but they want to understand how you're using it. And in the places where today we are really fighting for talent, there's trust with respect to your customer, but also trust with respect to your employees. And you're seeing that play out in many spaces. But and there's a lot of research that says companies that have trust, that's the new currency, right? And we really believe that, and we see that with the success of certain companies.
Trust is the currency if people and machines are going to work together successfully. Thank you so much, Paul and Julie. Join me in thanking them. Thank you.